Hi everyone, this is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I am doing a part 2 of my series on the nodes of the moon changing signs into Sagittarius and Gemini. So I really highly recommend that you check out 2 other videos to make the most sense out of this series. Obvious first one is the first video that I did, in which I break down the major archetypes of Mercury and Jupiter, Sagittarius and Gemini, and so forth, because that'll really give you a lot more to go on with this talk. Also, if you want to know more about the nodes of the moon on a technical and philosophical level, check out part 2 of the Mysteries of the Moon talks that I did in my archives, because that goes into the deeper esoteric meaning of the nodes of the moon in general. A brief explanation, a reminder: the nodes of the moon are the places at which eclipses take place. And so when we talk about the change of the nodes of the moon, we're talking about the change of signs that eclipses will be landing in. So between now, May of 2020, and January of 2022, we're getting eclipses with the North Node in Gemini and the South Node in Sagittarius. And what I want to do in this video is just give you a quick rundown of some of the major themes as they have appeared in the collective under the last 2 eclipse cycles that happened in Gemini and Sagittarius. So let's go back to the first period, which is between March of 2011 and August of 2012. Now, some of the interesting themes that show up in the collective, they're not identical to those that happen on the personal level, which is why if you want more a personal take, watch video 1 of the series. But one of the things that was really powerful in 2011 that took place that falls in line with the major dichotomy that I talked about in part 1 of the series, which has to do with the examination of beliefs and ideas, and this kind of pivotal turning point in terms of paradigms, especially around beliefs, but also even linked to things like technology, and even the law and stuff like that. In 2011, in the very beginning of 2011, there was a merchant who set himself on fire in Tunisia, and that experience, or that event, I should say, launched what was referred to as the Arab Spring. So if you don't know all about this, you could look up Arab Spring and check it out on Wikipedia. But it was a major series of political revolutions that happened basically in the Middle East. And it was started by a merchant. Now, Mercury is, of course, of the mercantile class, the merchants. And Mercury traditionally ruled money places. Like, think about the stock market and all of the flying information going everywhere. You need to think about the kind of exchange of money and currency and goods and trading, and that's all Mercury. The back and forth, like a basketball court, or like money changing hands in a marketplace. So you have a merchant that sets himself on fire in order to send a political message, very Mercury Jupiter. And then you have this launching of a destabilization of an entire region based on a paradigm change that was essentially happening at that time. It's all Mercury Jupiter. Right after that, Osama bin Laden was killed. And we also saw, of course, we're going to go back to the 2001 to 2003 eclipses. But of course, September 11th, 2001 happened under the first one. So we'll come back to that. But Osama bin Laden was killed around that time as well. Now, you also had, so that time, that also launched Occupy Wall Street. The Arab Spring was also very important in also producing this kind of challenge to the United States government, especially this kind of the people's protest, so to speak. And of course, a lot of it was rooted in the inequality of wealth, among other things. And it was called Occupy Wall Street. So you have the mercantile again with the Jupiterian theme, the religious, spiritual, political, the larger governing body or message or ideology, essentially Jupiterian themes, along with the mercantile class. Really interesting. You also saw destabilization of some of the markets in the world around that time in 2011, especially Greece, if I remember correctly. But yeah, there's also some kind of, there's a weird thing around chaos with Mercury and the larger container and the way that the two meet. So Jupiter ideally creates a container for the hustle and bustle of life. So you have the working rules of the economy or of legality or of justice and fairness and government and stuff like that. And then you have all of the daily commerce and daily activities. So the two kind of go together frequently. And during these periods of Sagittarius Gemini, essentially what you see is a relation between the higher ordering powers and ideologies and an examination, skepticism, or some kind of chaos that comes in to challenge them, and generally a period of sort of like destabilization and then reorientation of the larger system. Sometimes doesn't feel like much, but these are often really important political or religious periods of upheaval and revolution, mentally and intellectually, if not, actually physically. But you do see kind of some of the like both of these periods that I studied. There was a ton of like earthquakes and just natural disasters that call into question different aspects of society. For example, there was a 9.0 magnitude earthquake and tsunami hit off the coast of Japan, causing a nuclear meltdown. If you remember Fukushima, is that how I say it? That was after the nodes had changed signs as well. So right around that time, the nodes were changing signs. And of course, there's this potential for sort of like destabilizing energies. That's the gist of what Mercury does, whereas Jupiter stabilizes. So the push and pull between those energies actually in nature can be quite strong under double-bodied signs in general, because they're all Mercury, Jupiter, and they represent these kind of destabilizing periods that lead to instantiation of some new system or some new larger ideology or something like that. Then there's interesting. There were some big tech mergers during this period as well. So you think of technology, you think of Mercury, you think of merger, you think of Jupiter. AT&T, I think it was T-Mobile, if I'm remembering correctly, came together during the eclipses in Gemini and Sagittarius. If you go back to the previous eclipses we're going to talk about between 2001 and 2003, there was another big one. But so sometimes you see this this thing of like the disparate parts coming together to form a larger whole, but also the question about monopolies, which can develop as well. Monopolizing resources. The Occupy Wall Street was specifically about the question of the most wealth in the world belonging to the 1%. So the sort of monopolization of resources, or where the whole becomes more dominant than the part or parts, versus let's say the people or the parts, demanding that the whole have more respect for it. As an example, you'll also see when there's questioning of religious authorities or religious institutions. That's a very common theme with Sagittarius and Gemini, where the people or the lay person might say, hey, look, why can't I talk to God personally, as in the Protestant Reformation? Or why can't the connection to God be more direct? Why do we need an intermediary figure? And that sometimes comes up specifically when institutions and religious figures throughout history, themes like this anyway, will come up when religious institutions or leaders have in some ways abused their office or their power and don't really have the parts in mind. So the part versus the whole again. Now, if you go back to 2001 to 2003, during the previous eclipse cycles in Gemini and Sagittarius, there was another tech merger, which was America Online and Time Warner. Do you remember AOL? It feels like it's been a while. But that was a big one, and there were questions again about monopolization. There were significant earthquakes again. There's a very interesting thing. It seems like, oh, this was such a controversy back then compared to today. It's like, it seems really weak. But the Alabama Supreme Court justice, I forget his name, had the 10 Commandments installed in the Judiciary Committee, and it created a big controversy. So there you have very much the figure of, a religious / societal institution kind of blending and merging, and there's protest, and there's a sense of calling that into question and challenging that. So ideals, ideologies, and conversation, debate, or dialogue about them, even challenges back and forth. So of course, then you have the September 11th attacks, which are ideologically, religiously, politically motivated, as was the response to them in controversial and really dark ways. So TWA merged with American Airlines. You also think about the themes of travel sometimes, or travel and change, or migration and immigration sometimes too. But yeah, the theme of merger again comes up. Um, and the Homeland Security Act was put into place around that time, which had was a whole systemic overhaul of the travel system. So Mercury is a god associated with travel, and you have larger laws being put into place around travel and so forth. Anyway, those are just some interesting things to kind of compare with both periods. It's interesting to note that in 2001, Saturn and Pluto were opposed to one another back then, as they're conjoined now. And that also had a big, like that, the tie-in between 2001 and the kind of moment we were living through in 2001 around September 11th is more similar to what we're living through now, even compared to, 2011 to 2012, when there was Occupy Wall Street and so forth, because you just have that Saturn Pluto energy in the air right now, which is a lot more intense. Actually, SARS epidemic began in 2001 to 2003 in China. And then in 2012, I think you had another, oh, what is it? There was maybe another coronavirus that came around, I want to say in the Middle East somewhere. And I think it was 2012. So there's also questions about things that are widespread that can kind of infiltrate and create chaos. So ideally, in a world where there's like sovereign nations, I mean, we've made all this up, right? But there's like sovereign nations, and they have borders and they kind of have their own thing going on, and then there's some ways in which they overlap. But when something comes in, it spreads all over simultaneously, like an epidemic or the threat of an epidemic. It also calls into question ideas about larger unities and working together beyond national or personal interest. So there's that collective theme of Jupiter that wants to pull everything together into a larger whole, and Mercury will either resist that, or Mercury will be the chaos that causes that, or the response to it. So anyway, those are all things that you can look for. I would love to hear your reflections on all of this. This video is a little bit shorter, but I wanted to make a separate video to run through the exact collective events that I had tracked very, kind of briefly, but just to give you a sense of what kind of themes we'll probably see. If I had to make a bold prediction of a fearless forecast or something like that, I would say that we're in for a time of very deep questioning of truth, of what is true and of where we place our faith, and of questioning different institutions. I wouldn't be surprising to see real ideological battles stepping up significantly, and a time of destabilization, probably, and change or turnover, economically and governmentally. I don't think I'm saying anything that's that fearless or that like that's, but the reason I try to keep it simple is that, I don't believe astrology at the end of the day is about sitting around trying to get predictions right. There's an element of predictive nature to astrology to understand what season we're living through. We're living through a season collectively with these eclipses where our intellectual, spiritual, moral framework is going to be challenged, and there are going to be events that come chaotically but creatively to help us revision our personal lives and our collective lives. And I think it's going to be a little bit more collective at this point in time, because the personal and the collective will overlap in a much stronger way than normal, because we've got Pluto and Saturn finishing up for a good bit of this. So that's part 2. I'm going to come back at you with part 3, and I'll be going with the nodes through the houses. So we'll take the nodes through the houses to give you a sense of what you can expect. All right, take it easy, everyone. Hi, everyone. This is the acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and I'm adding a little technical note onto my series on the nodes of the moon changing signs. I'm anticipating that people who are maybe a little bit more intermediate in their studies may have some questions about the way in which I timed out the eclipses in the last 2 Gemini Sagittarius eclipse cycles. And also, I realized that I wanted to give the exact dates and degrees of all of the eclipses coming up in Gemini and Sagittarius, because that might be interesting for people to follow along with. So I'm going to do that briefly. All right, so first of all, people might go, hey, you know what? Back in 2001, you were talking about the Sagittarius Gemini eclipses, and you didn't add in the fact that the September 11th attacks actually happened while the nodes of the moon were still in Cancer and Capricorn. Totally fair. And they actually didn't change signs, the nodes, until October of 2001. So I really see these as, uh, the changing of the nodes is a sign of the times, that in the wake of those attacks, there are these very deep questions about religion, ideology, government, and so forth, that it represents a period that is a little chaotic and disturbing to the status quo, especially sort of mentally and intellectually questioning the foundations of society and the moral fabric of the world and so forth. And these are big Gemini Sagittarius questions that I see as kind of coming in the wake of those attacks. Technically, you're right, the nodes of the moon don't change signs until October. But here's another reason why I'm just a little bit more liberal when it comes to the changing of the nodes of the moon. Because if you go back to June 21st, 2001, there's a solar eclipse at 0 Cancer. But it's forming in the anaretic degree of the end of Gemini. And I've heard a number of astrologers over the years speak about this as, a kind of foreshadowing of the twin towers falling, specifically because you have the sun and the sign of the twins, two twin objects standing next to each other, right as the eclipse is happening. Um, and yeah, so at any rate, people might think that that's a bit of a stretch, but there's another example of this that I'll show you in the 2011 eclipse cycles that started in Sagittarius and Gemini that I talked about as well. Anyway, the simple point is that I pay attention to eclipses forming right around the beginning or end of signs as the nodes are changing signs, because I consider those to be like foreshadows of the subject change to come. So at any rate, I do see I see the events of September 11th in terms of both, you could say, the Cancer Capricorn axis and the Gemini Sagittarius axis. I think they're more purely about Gemini Sagittarius, especially when you look at the United States' birth chart. And also, yeah, just again, I think that the major thing that happens in the wake of those events is this deep questioning of the moral, political, sort of spiritual fabric of mankind, or at least of different parts of the world anyway. So I mean, for the kind of the world of Islam and the world of Western Christianity, that they come into real dialogue, as do different political political and religious issues start mingling at any rate. Okay, so anyway, that's why my time zone is just a little bit broader. And some people might have, picked up on that and wondered why I did that. And then if we go forward also to 2010, interestingly, in 2010, we have a very similar phenomenon. When you go to the very end of December of 2010 on the winter solstice, again, you have the Gemini Sagittarius axis lit up with a lunar eclipse. This time it's actually a lunar eclipse happening. It doesn't fall across the sign. It doesn't go into Cancer. It actually falls at the very last degree of Gemini, but the nodes have not changed signs yet. So that eclipse I also see as a kind of foreshadowing of the coming Sagittarius and Gemini nodal change. Of course, what happens in the following month, which people may also have picked up on, is that the nodes are still in Cancer and Capricorn in January, when the Tunisian, merchant sets himself on fire, and that becomes the domino to tip the rest over in the Arab Spring and eventually influencing Occupy Wall Street and stuff like that. So again, I have a little bit broader of an orb that I use for eclipses, because I do pay attention to those that are happening right at the end of the sign boundaries as the nodes are changing. You can see this actually right now. A similar thing is happening, right? We have the pandemic happening right as the nodes are about to change signs into Gemini and Sagittarius. And so I've got to think, maybe there is some kind of overlap there between Cancer Capricorn and the kind of cardinality that they imply, these cardinal, really dynamic, pivotal events that happen. And then they're followed by this deep, moral, spiritual, philosophical, political, ideological tension that comes in. So at any rate, I thought you might be interested to just see kind of how and why I used a little bit broader time frame if you were scratching your head about that. Last but not least, I wanted to go through the actual dates of the eclipses for you. So I'm just going to put the date on the screen for you along with the degree so that you can track those if you're interested. So first eclipse in Sagittarius happens on June 5th of 2020. It's at about 15 degrees of Sagittarius. You can look at that in your birth chart. The next one falls June 20th. There's a solar eclipse again, just right across the sign boundary, right on that summer solstice time period again, into the early degrees of Cancer, while the nodes are at late Gemini Sag. So pay attention to that one too. Look at about 0 Cancer in your chart. Then November 30th, we got a lunar eclipse in Gemini at about 8 degrees. That's November 30th of 2020. And then December 14th, solar eclipse in Sagittarius, and that one falls at about 23 degrees. And then in 2021, May 26th, there's a lunar eclipse in Gemini at about 5 degrees. June 10th, there's a solar eclipse in Gemini at about 19 degrees. And December 4th, there is a solar eclipse in Sagittarius at about 12 degrees. So that is just a little extra technical note, because I know some people who watch my channel are more, they pay more attention to those details and might have scratched their head about, why I chose some of those dates. And also people who pay more attention to the dates and degrees of eclipses might want to have known the exact details of the upcoming eclipses in Sag and Gemini. So hopefully this was useful, and I hope you enjoyed the series overall. All right, take it easy, everyone. Bye.